I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. Tennis had always been our thing. My wife, Julia, and I bonded over the game when we first met, and it became a tradition in our marriage. Every Saturday, we'd hit the courts, play a few sets, and then enjoy lunch at our favorite cafe afterward. Lately, however, things had changed. Julia had taken a sudden interest in practicing more often, especially with this new coach she had met at the club. His name was Ian, a tall, muscular guy with the kind of arrogance that comes with being too attractive for his own good. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, Julia was serious about improving her game, and I was swamped with work. If she wanted to spend more time on the court, I wasn't going to be the one to stop her. But then, the subtle shifts in her behavior began to gnaw at me. The late-night practices, the extra showers when she got home, the sudden avoidance of inviting me to the court with her. It was like she was pulling away from our routine, from me. I should have confronted her right away, asked her what was going on, but I hesitated. A small part of me didn't want to know. Ignorance felt safer than facing whatever truth was slowly creeping into our marriage. But that safety net quickly unraveled when one evening, while casually flipping through her phone, I saw her schedule, 5 practices that week, all with Ian. That was when the suspicion planted its seed. One Saturday afternoon, instead of going into the office like I had told her, I decided to head to the tennis club. I had to know what was really going on. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the court where Julia said she'd be practicing. From a distance, I could see them, Julia in her white tennis skirt, her laughter echoing across the court. Ian was with her, holding a racket, but not playing. He was standing much too close for comfort. I stepped back, concealing myself behind a hedge as my suspicions took on a more sinister shape. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I couldn't pull myself away. It felt like watching a slow-motion car crash, knowing the inevitable destruction was just around the corner. And then, it happened. Ian leaned in as they paused between sets, his hand slowly reaching for her waist. Julia giggled, as he slid his hand under her tennis skirt. She didn't pull away. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she blushed, her lips curving into a smile I hadn't seen in months. The sight of it shattered something inside me. That smile, that look of pleasure, it wasn't for me anymore. I wanted to burst out of the bushes, demand an explanation, scream at her for what she was doing. But something held me back. It wasn't the fear of confrontation, it was the growing seed of revenge taking root in my mind. Julia had betrayed me, but I wasn't going to be the fool who raged and left it at that. No, I wanted to make her pay for this, to feel the sting of betrayal as deeply as I did in that moment. I turned around and left, walking away from the court with the image of her laugh burned into my mind. The thoughts racing through my head were chaotic, but one thing was clear, I needed a plan. At home, I sat in the kitchen, staring at a bottle of whiskey, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside me. Anger, disbelief, sadness, it all churned together, but it was the desire for vengeance that won out. I couldn't let this go, not without consequences. If Julia thought she could humiliate me like this, she was wrong. The first step was subtle. I distanced myself from her, stopped asking about her practices, and even encouraged her to spend more time with Ian. I wanted her to feel secure, like her little secret was safe. That way, when I struck, it would hurt all the more. She wouldn't see it coming. I started preparing, carefully laying the groundwork for her downfall. I went through our finances, our mutual friends, everything we'd built together. I wanted to know exactly how I could dismantle her life without raising any suspicion. It was going to take time, but I was patient. I would wait for the perfect moment to pull the rug from under her. As the days passed, Julia seemed oblivious. She continued her practices, blissfully unaware of my plans. Whenever I saw her smile after coming home from her sessions, it only fueled my resolve. I kept telling myself that she didn't deserve to get away with this. The revenge wouldn't just be personal, it would be meticulous, strategic. By the time I was done, she would have nothing left but regret. One night, as we lay in bed, I glanced over at her. She was scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. I could see the faint smile playing on her lips, and I knew she was thinking about him, about Ian. It made me sick. I turned over, my back to her, as the final pieces of my plan began to fall into place. I'd let her think everything was fine for just a little longer, let her sink deeper into her fantasy. When the time came, I would take everything from her, the house, the car, the life we'd built. She would walk away with nothing but the memory of what she had ruined. Julia had betrayed me, but I wasn't going to be the victim. I was going to be the one who walked away with everything, while she crumbled in the wake of her own choices. I would make sure of it. And so, the game began. For the next few days, I played the part of the oblivious husband. Julia carried on with her practices, spending more and more time at the tennis club. It was almost laughable how comfortable she'd become, as if the affair with Ian was some harmless secret she could keep hidden forever. But I saw it all, and each time she left with that carefree smile, it only reinforced my desire to make her pay for what she'd done. One evening, while we sat together at the dinner table, Julia glanced up from her phone and casually mentioned, "Ian wants to work on my backhand tomorrow. It's been a little off lately." I took a slow sip of my wine, keeping my face neutral. "That's great, Jules. You've been improving a lot. I can tell." She smiled, seemingly pleased with my support. "Yeah, he's been a great coach. He really pushes me." I bet he does, I thought, the bitterness swirling inside me. But I just smiled and nodded, letting her believe I was the same clueless, supportive husband I'd always been. Little did she know, I was already one step ahead. The next morning, I put the final touches on my plan. I called my lawyer, a shrewd man who specialized in divorce settlements, and scheduled a meeting. Julia and I had a joint account, a house in both our names, and a car she loved almost as much as her precious tennis sessions. All of it was leverage, and I intended to use every bit of it against her. That afternoon, I followed her again. This time, I didn't bother hiding. I knew what I would find, and frankly, I wanted her to see me, to see that I knew, without ever saying a word. I arrived at the club a little earlier than her scheduled practice. My stomach churned as I made my way to the courts. When I reached the familiar court where they usually met, my heart sank. There she was, in her tennis skirt, laughing at something Ian said as they stood far too close, their bodies almost touching. I could see his hand brushing against her back, lingering on the small of her waist as they exchanged that same conspiratorial smile. The same one that used to belong to me. Without thinking, I stepped forward, clearing my throat loud enough to be heard over the soft thwack of tennis balls from nearby courts. Both of them froze, their heads whipping around to see me standing there. For a moment, Julia's eyes widened, her smile faltering. She glanced at Ian, who quickly pulled his hand away from her waist. "Hey, honey," Julia greeted me, her voice forced and high-pitched. "What are you doing here? I thought you had work." I crossed my arms, raising an eyebrow. "Work finished early. Thought I'd drop by, see how things are going with your practice." Ian stepped back, awkwardly adjusting his racket, but I could see the way he tensed up. He wasn't as slick as he thought. "Ah, hey, nice to see you again," he mumbled, obviously uncomfortable under my gaze. Julia, ever the actress, forced a smile and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, just working on my backhand. Ian's been really helpful." I let the silence stretch, my gaze flicking between the two of them. I could feel the tension in the air, thick like humidity before a storm. Ian was fidgeting, shifting from one foot to the other, while Julia avoided my eyes. She knew I was onto something, even if she didn't know exactly how much I had seen. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment where she started to panic, where she realized she wasn't in control anymore. Helpful? I repeated slowly, letting the word hang in the air. Yeah, he seems very hands-on. Julia's face flushed red, her eyes darting toward Ian for some kind of reassurance, but he offered none. Well, it's just part of the game, she stammered. You know, to get better. I took a step closer, narrowing my eyes as I looked at Ian. Is that right? Part of the game? Ian gulped, clearly uncomfortable. I think maybe we should wrap up here, he said quickly, turning to Julia. We can continue tomorrow. I think you've had enough practice for today. Julia nodded, avoiding my gaze as she gathered her things. She was rattled, no longer the confident, carefree woman who thought she could fool me. I didn't stop her. Let her leave, let her stew in the mess she'd created. It was exactly what I wanted. When we got home later that evening, Julia was uncharacteristically quiet. She moved around the house with a nervous energy, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. I could see it in her eyes, the fear, the uncertainty. She was wondering if I knew. She was wondering how much longer she could keep up the charade. After dinner, as we sat on the couch in silence, I finally spoke. Julia. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected me to say anything. Yeah. I think we need to talk. My voice was calm, too calm, and I could see the way it made her tense. About what? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I met her eyes, holding her gaze for a long, painful moment before speaking. About you. About Ian. About what you think you're hiding from me. Her face drained of color, and I could see the panic flash in her eyes. I don't know what you mean, she stammered, but her voice betrayed her. You don't know what I mean. I repeated, my tone hardening. I'm not stupid, Julia. I've seen the way you look at him. I've seen what goes on at those so-called practices. So, don't insult me by pretending like nothing's happening. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Her eyes welled up with tears, and for the first time in a long while, I saw fear in her face. Fear of what was to come. Fear of what she had done. I'm going to make this very clear, I said, my voice low and deliberate. I know everything, Julia. I know about the affair, and I know that you've been lying to me for months. The tears finally spilled over, running down her cheeks as she shook her head in disbelief. I didn't mean for it to happen, she sobbed. I was confused, I didn't. Spare me, I cut her off, my voice cold. You knew exactly what you were doing. And now, you're going to face the consequences. Her eyes widened in horror as the realization of my words sank in. There would be no forgiveness, no reconciliation. Only revenge. I'm leaving, I said, standing up from the couch. And when I'm done, you'll have nothing left. I left her sitting there, broken and trembling, the life she had once known crumbling around her. This was only the beginning of her punishment. The next phase would be much worse. I had waited long enough. Now, it was time to act. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sobs of Julia from the other room. She hadn't come to bed. She stayed on the couch, curled up in her guilt and confusion, trying to figure out how her carefully hidden affair had unraveled so quickly. But it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The next step was already in motion, and by the end, Julia would understand what real betrayal felt like. The next morning, the silence between us was deafening. Julia avoided me, skittering around the house like a nervous wreck, her eyes swollen from crying, her hands trembling as she made her morning coffee. I watched her from the kitchen doorway, feeling a grim satisfaction at how rattled she was. She tried to speak a few times, her lips parting as if to say something, but the words never came. Maybe she thought an apology would fix things, or maybe she was too afraid to admit the full extent of what she had done. Either way, I wasn't interested in hearing it. I had my plan, and I was going to see it through. As I finished my coffee, I stood up and grabbed my keys from the counter. "I'll be gone most of the day," I said flatly, not bothering to look at her. Julia's eyes flicked up, startled by the coldness in my voice. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice small. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked out the door, leaving her in the suffocating silence of our broken home. I drove across town to meet with my lawyer, the man who was going to help me dismantle Julia's world. His office was on the top floor of a sleek building downtown, a place where the wealthy came to settle their disputes in private. As I sat in the waiting room, flipping through a magazine without actually reading the words, I thought about all the ways Julia had betrayed me. Her laugh with Ian, the way she had blushed when he touched her, the lies she'd told me every day for months. It all fueled my determination. "Mr. Callahan," a voice called out, and I looked up to see my lawyer's assistant standing at the door. "He's ready for you." I followed her into a large, glass-walled office where my lawyer, Roger, was seated behind a polished oak desk. He stood up to greet me, his sharp eyes assessing me with the same calculating look he probably gave to all his clients. "David," he said, offering his hand. "I understand you have a situation you need dealt with." "That's right," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "My wife's been cheating on me, and I want her out of my life. Completely." Roger nodded, sitting back down as he motioned for me to take a seat. "You're looking for a divorce, then?" "Divorce is part of it," I said, my voice cold. "But I want more than that. I want to make sure she walks away with nothing." Roger's lips curled into a thin smile. "That's what I do best." By the time I left Roger's office, I had a plan in place. It wasn't just about divorcing Julia, it was about leaving her with absolutely nothing. The house, the car, our joint accounts, I was going to make sure she had no access to any of it. All I needed was a little more time to put everything in motion. When I got home, Julia was waiting for me in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't eaten, judging by the untouched plate of toast on the counter. The air between us was thick with unspoken tension, the weight of everything that had been shattered hanging in the silence. "David," she said quietly, wringing her hands together, "we need to talk." I set my keys down on the table and leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "Talk about what, Julia? About how you've been sneaking around with Ian for months? Or about how you thought I wouldn't find out?" Her face crumpled, and she let out a small sob. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Didn't mean for it to happen. You've been lying to me, Julia, every time you went to those practices. You didn't just fall into this, it was a choice. A choice to betray me." She stepped closer, her eyes pleading. I was confused. "It wasn't serious, David, I swear. I made a mistake, but I love you. Please, can't we fix this?" I stared at her, feeling nothing but disgust. The desperation in her voice, the tears streaming down her face, it was too little, too late. "Fix this?" I repeated, my voice cold. "You think we can just patch this up and pretend everything's fine?" She nodded, taking another step toward me. "We can go to counseling. We can work through this, David. I know I hurt you, but I don't want to lose you." I clenched my jaw, the rage simmering beneath my skin. "You already lost me, Julia. The moment you let him touch you, you lost everything." Her face twisted in pain, and she collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. I watched her for a moment, my chest tight with anger and betrayal. There was a time when I might have felt sorry for her, might have wanted to comfort her, but that time was long gone. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my voice steady and emotionless. "And I'm taking everything." Julia looked up, her eyes wide with shock. "What?" "David, no, you can't just." I can, and I will, I interrupted, my voice harsh. You think you can destroy everything we've built and walk away unscathed? You're wrong. You're going to feel what it's like to have nothing. She stood up, panic flashing in her eyes. But the house, the car. David, we've built this life together. You can't just take it all away. I smiled coldly. Watch me. I left her there, in the kitchen, crumbling under the weight of her own actions. The paperwork was already in motion, the legal gears turning in my favor. Julia had no idea how deep the trap had been set, and by the time she realized, it would be too late. That evening, I sat in my office, looking over the documents Roger had sent me. Everything was in order. The divorce would be swift, brutal, and leave Julia with nothing. The house would be mine, the accounts frozen, the assets secured. All she would have left was Ian, and knowing him, that wouldn't last long. I thought about confronting Ian, about punching him in his smug face, but that wasn't part of the plan. He wasn't worth the effort. Besides, the best revenge would be watching Julia realize that her little fling had cost her everything. She'd come to see that Ian wasn't going to be there to pick up the pieces. He was just a distraction, a temporary thrill. And when the dust settled, she'd be standing in the wreckage of her own making. As I signed the last of the papers, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. This was justice. Julia had betrayed me, but I wasn't the victim. I was the one who was going to walk away, while she watched her life fall apart. The game wasn't over yet, but the final move was mine. The paperwork was done. Julia's world was about to come crashing down, but she didn't know it yet. I had meticulously ensured that every asset, every account, and every ounce of comfort she had grown accustomed to would be stripped away from her in the divorce. The last few days had been tense, with Julia desperately clinging to the hope that I'd change my mind. But I hadn't. I wouldn't. It was time for the final act. That afternoon, I received a message from Roger confirming that the papers were ready to be served. Everything was in place. I would watch her fall apart today. I couldn't deny the twisted satisfaction I felt as I headed home, my plan fully formed in my mind. I had waited for this moment, a moment to reveal how deeply her betrayal had cut me and to make her pay for every smile, every laugh, every touch she had shared with Ian. When I got home, Julia was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and tense. She looked up at me with hope in her eyes, but there was also fear. She knew something was coming. David, she began, her voice trembling, I know things have been terrible between us, but I've been thinking, maybe we can still work this out. I'll stop seeing Ian. It was a mistake, I see that now. We can start over. I walked toward her slowly, my eyes locked on hers. I could see the desperation written all over her face, the way she clung to the fragile hope that I might forgive her. Start over. I repeated, my voice low. You really think we can go back to what we had? She nodded frantically. I love you, David. I was stupid, I lost sight of what matters. But we can fix this, I swear. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Fix this? Julia, the moment you let that bastard touch you, there was nothing left to fix. Her face crumpled, and she reached out to me, but I stepped back, pulling away from her touch. The revulsion I felt for her was too strong. You don't get it, do you? You broke us, Julia. You ruined everything. She sobbed quietly, her hands trembling. David, please, I'm begging you. I ignored her, turning toward the hallway and motioning for her to follow. Come with me, I said, my voice cold and commanding. There's something you need to see. She hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes, but she obeyed. I led her to my office, the door already slightly ajar. Inside, everything was laid out on the desk, the divorce papers, the financial records, the evidence of her affair. It was all there, waiting for her to see. What is this? She asked, her voice shaky. Take a look, I said, crossing my arms. See for yourself. She stepped forward cautiously, her eyes scanning the documents, and I watched as the realization dawned on her. The color drained from her face, and her hands flew to her mouth as she read the divorce filing, the list of assets that would now belong to me, and the evidence that I had gathered about her infidelity. No, she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. David, no, you can't do this. This is everything. I stepped closer, my voice sharp as I spoke. You thought you could just cheat on me and walk away? You thought I wouldn't find out? That I'd just sit here and take it? Her eyes filled with tears as she clutched the papers to her chest. David, please, don't do this. We can talk about this. We can. There's nothing to talk about. I snapped, my voice rising. You destroyed our marriage, Julia. You threw it all away for some cheap fling. Now you're going to lose everything. She crumbled, collapsing onto the chair as the full weight of what was happening hit her. But, the house, the money. All mine, I said coldly. And when the papers are signed, you'll have nothing. Not even him. Julia looked up at me, confusion and panic etched across her face. What do you mean? Ian, I said with a smirk, stepping closer to her. You think he's going to be there for you after this? You think he'll stick around when you've got no house, no money, and no future? She blinked, trying to process my words. He loves me, we'll figure something out. I laughed again, shaking my head. Oh, Julia, you're so naive. You really think I didn't plan for this? I took care of Ian, too. Her eyes widened in horror. What did you do? I leaned in, my voice dropping to a menacing whisper. I made sure his life is just as ruined as yours. She stood up, stumbling back in shock. What? What did you do to him? I crossed my arms, relishing the panic in her voice. Let's just say that Ian had a few skeletons in his closet. Affairs with more than just you, gambling debts he couldn't pay. I made sure his employer found out about it all. He's out of a job, Julia. No money. No future. Just like you. The tears streamed down her face as the reality of my betrayal hit her. You destroyed him. I destroyed both of you, I said, my voice icy. And now, I'm walking away. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The woman who had once been so confident, so smug in her affair, was now a broken shell of herself. I stood there for a moment, watching her crumble, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. This was what betrayal felt like: pain, destruction, and the loss of everything she had once held dear. Just as I turned to leave the room, there was a knock at the front door. I glanced at Julia, who remained motionless on the floor, her sobs quieting into soft whimpers. Without a word, I walked toward the door, knowing exactly who it was. I opened it to reveal the process server, holding the divorce papers in hand. He glanced at me, then at Julia, his expression unreadable. "Are you David Callahan?" he asked. I nodded. "That's me." He handed me the papers and said, "You've been served." I turned to Julia, still crumpled in the hallway, the realization of her fate fully sinking in. I dropped the papers onto the floor beside her and walked out of the house without looking back. As I stepped outside, I felt the weight of everything lift off my shoulders. Julia and I were over. The game was done, and I had won. But as I walked away, there was no joy in victory. Only a deep, hollow emptiness. Revenge had come at a price, and in the end, it hadn't filled the void her betrayal had left behind. It had only made me more like her, cold, cruel, and alone. We had parted forever, not just because of her infidelity, but because we had both destroyed the love we once shared. And in the end, we were both left with nothing.